So we come at last to the final video in this series looking at the 12-inch Doctor Who figures from Character Options from all the way back in 2006 and 7. And I've saved the Cybermen until last. Now I wish I could say that I'd saved the best till last, but sadly that just isn't the case, and we'll delve into the reasons why as we go through this video. But first of all, in terms of the packaging, there's no real surprises here. The Cybermen came in the standard Doctor Who 12-inch packaging. As we have seen, it has the logos and colouring of the brand of the time, which is the fiery yellows and red, and of course we have an image of the Cyberman in the lower left corner, and we have that wonderful window display showing the Cyberman in all his glory. And to be fair, in his box, and even when he's first released from his packaging, he does look visually very impressive. It looks like a miniature Cyberman from that era of Doctor Who come to life, which is absolutely fantastic. Their dimensions and proportions look really accurate and authentic, which is always a great start. And the sculpting of the face and the armour all over looks pretty faithful to what we see on screen. I think they've done a really nice job of capturing that. And I should point out that they did a number of variants of these Cybermen. So you had your basic Cyberman with the silver ears or handlebars. And they also released this version with the black ears or handlebars, which is of course the Cyber Leader. He is glimpsed quite briefly in the show, but nevertheless is a really cool addition to this toy line, and it's nice to see the hierarchy amongst the Cybermen, which is always kind of fun, and it's nice to have a different variant of the Cyberman, especially for those who wish to army build. You'll also notice there's areas of shading on the armour of the Cyberman as well, which is a nice touch, adds a little bit more texture to this figure and gives it that more authentic look and feel, which is brilliant. On the Cyber Leader, he's a little bit different to the other Cybermen in this line in that his chest piece can actually be removed, and underneath we can see the electrical circuitry of where the heart should be. And this is a really nice touch. I think it's very nicely painted and it's got a little bit of detail in there, and it's a fun little extra to have that some of the other figures in this line didn't. Now, the Cyber Leader has individual unique hands as well. His left hand has that open hand, which is sort of grasping, which you can put on the shoulder of other figures in the collection if you want them to give that electrical shock. Meanwhile, his right hand has a sort of semi-closed hand with a pointing finger. This is, pardon the pun, pretty handy if you want him to be able to grasp or keep hold of particular items. And as we can see, the armour effect, the plastic pieces are wrapped around the entirety of this figure. There's careful places where there's little gaps to be able to allow the figure to have some articulation, but the hard plastic works really quite well in terms of the visual. There's nice shading on it, and it's pretty authentic to what we see on screen. So far so good, so what's the problem? Well, it is all about the articulation. He does have a swivel at the head. You'll remember that the other figures in this line had a ball joint in the neck which allowed the head to nod forwards and backwards. Sadly, the Cyberman can only spin his head from side to side. Likewise, he doesn't have ball joints in the shoulders. He just has a straight swivel at the shoulder which allows his arm to kick up and down. And of course, he has a single joint at the elbow which again only allows the arm to bend to 90 degrees. There is another swivel at the wrist, which will allow the hand to rotate from side to side most of the way, but it is blocked a little bit by the gauntlet of the armour, which is a real shame, and it cannot hinge forwards or backwards. There's also a swivel at the waist. Again, no ball joint here, so it can only move from side to side, and even then, only fractionally, barely at all. He's got another swivel at the hips, and once again the leg doesn't really go very far forwards or backwards because it is hindered by those plastic armour pieces, which is a real shame. He's got a single joint at the knee which works perfectly well. It bends to 90 degrees with no problem, and he does have some articulation in the foot. It can kind of move from side to side and it kind of wobbles forwards and backwards, but not enough to really be able to be positioned. The Cyber Leader is interesting because he also does come with an accessory piece as well. He comes with this metal coil which is quite nicely painted, quite nicely sculpted, pretty accurate to what we see on screen again. So this is a nice little prop for him to have. And it does fit quite neatly into his grip, and he will hold this quite comfortably without it falling out of his grip, which is quite nice. Now, in terms of scaling, this is roughly correct. If we put him next to the 10th Doctor from the same line, we can see that he is just fractionally taller than the 10th Doctor, which is as it should be. The Cyberman should really be a little bit broader too, and a bit taller than the 10th Doctor, so I think they've done a pretty decent job at keeping these roughly in scale. There's also one more very cool final variant, and that is the Cyber Controller, the absolute arch overlord of the Cybermen, and this is a really fantastic opportunity to have this variant, and I'm very glad to have him in the collection. He has a very cool and very distinct design, look and feel, which is brilliant, and I think they've done a really nice job of capturing that here, both in the sculpt and in the paint apps. Most noticeably, we can see it in that head sculpt there and actually seeing the transparent brain underneath that transparent plastic. I think that's really very striking and is a very, very cool look. Of course, he also has slightly different handlebars and he has those piercing bright blue eyes, which I think they've done a really nice job of all in all. Now, whilst for the most part everything else is pretty much identical to the other Cybermen in this line, you will notice there's a few subtle differences here and there. Most noticeably, he does have those 6 protruding plugs on his chest piece there, which obviously in the show connect to his throne, but is otherwise pretty much identical to the other Cybermen in this line. His chest piece, I think it's important to note, is not removable. The other subtle difference about the Cyber Controller is that he does have different hands, the Cyber Leader. He does have that gripping left hand, and he has a very subtly different right hand. It is a pointing finger, but actually the finger is somewhat curled, and the grip is a lot tighter. Ultimately, there's something a little disappointing about these Cybermen. I'm a huge Cyberman fan and I was so anticipating the release of these figures. Having a 12-inch Cyberman was just wonderful to me when I was younger. And having seen some of the other fantastic figures in this line who had wonderful articulation and fantastic fabric costumes, I was really highly anticipating the release of these figures. And I fully appreciate that because they have that metal armor or that plastic armor in the figures case, it's always going to present certain challenges for toy makers to be able to get the most out of any articulation, but they didn't give these figures the articulation to begin with. I feel like if they had expanded and given these the same articulation as we saw on the other bodies, yes, it would have been restricted by the plastic armor, but there would have been a bit more give and a bit more room to maneuver, and I think it's a real shame that we haven't got that posability out of these figures, because the Cybermen on screen, certainly they're a little bit stiff and robotic, but they have plenty of movement and they're able to do different things that sadly you just cannot replicate those stances with these figures. So they are very nicely produced though in terms of their look and design. And there's some nice attempts at texturing, particularly in the shading that they've provided, and I think they look the part really quite nicely. It's just a shame that you can't really do too much with them if they're not standing stock still. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.